they made it so visual, and it was a mass movement, so you couldn't ignore it. So just as a news thing, you couldn't ignore something like the Narmada Bachao Andolan, what they were doing. The Jal Satyagraha, which we now heard about recently in Omkareshwar, actually already had taken place in '93 and earlier by the NBA and was covered by much of the media. So, but whether the media was hostile, as was the media in Gujarat, for instance, which was very hostile to the NBA, or whether it was slightly sympathetic, supportive, again, as far as the NBA is concerned, it didn't make a difference. I mean, the media could not break the NBA by being hostile or make it, because it was already grounded. It was already a movement that had built its roots, and it was not dependent on whether the media will give its support or not. But it used the media, which is, I think, very different from just something coming up which bases entirely on how much the media support will be. And for that, I think we have the classic example of the Anna movement. I think the Anna movement really depended on media. I think they designed their campaigns to ensure that the media covered it, and the media fell hook, line and sinker, because this was a great tamasha. And it didn't require much effort, because they were all just there, you know. You didn't have to go anywhere. They were in fact in front of you. They were wearing those topis, there were lots of things going on, there were big personalities, and it was about corruption, you know, in high places. It had all the elements of a great story, and as you know, when they did that Jantar Mantar and the demand for the Lokpal Bill, it got blanket coverage, which I think really any rational media person will say was completely unjustified. In a country of 1.2 billion, where there are hundreds of things happening and important issues that are not being covered, for television to just block out everything else and to give that blanket coverage, I really do not think was justified. But whatever. It happened, and I think that contributed hugely to the sense that the Anna movement was much bigger than it actually was. I mean, I personally went to Azad Maidan and saw how many people were there for one of the demonstrations. I went back home, switched on the television. The way the shots were taken, you would think there were many more. And to the uninformed, it seemed like there were many more. There was huge popular support, but there wasn't. There was a much smaller number, but it was a close angle taken to give that impression. So it was actually a collusion between the media and the Anna movement to make it seem larger than life. And it's very interesting how the next year when they protested, they all turned on the media and said the media had let them down. It's not the job of the media to support. So to accuse the media of letting you down has a two-part thing to it. One, that the movement was depending so much on the media that I don't think they grounded themselves enough on what they were all about, which is now coming apart in many ways. You know, we don't know what are they about, what are they actually trying to do. But the other side of it is, I think, the media losing its balance on picking on what is an easy story to do and a middle class story to do, which is basically our audience for many of us in the media, and blowing it out of all proportion to the reality of what it actually, and not asking the tough questions that should be asked of all these movements. So I think the Anna movement is a very interesting thing to study also in terms of how the media breaks and makes movements. As an aside, I just want to say it's very interesting how this huge march of the landless that was taken out recently and culminated in Agra, how little coverage it got. I mean, it really is extraordinary to me that landless people from all over India were marching, demanding land, such an important issue for millions of people in this country. The media had no time for it. No time for it. In fact, I saw more coverage in foreign newspapers and long articles written in New York Times and The Guardian than in some of our newspapers. And that really is a shocking thing, but I think it also tells of the same preoccupation where the media today has decided that its audience is basically middle class. So it is middle class concerns that dominate. So whatever story is both easy and representing those concerns gains the kind of prominence that the Anna movement got, whereas the concerns of the landless people in this country, it may be a passing paragraph here, maybe one photograph, but nothing that explains what is it that motivated these people to go out there to march for all these days. You know, who organized them? How long have they been organized? What are the issues? They must be different in different states. How did it all add up together to this much? I have not till today, I may be wrong, I don't read all newspapers, I have not till today seen anything, and I certainly didn't see any television discussions of any depth on that issue. Now coming to the question we're looking at, which is the nuclear question, which is linked up with movements to some extent, but in the early years, in fact, I think I can date it back to maybe the late 70s, when the first questioning began of the nuclear establishment. Some of the early articles that started appearing questioning the Atomic Energy Act and how draconian it was and how undemocratic it was, and suggesting that the AERB was not really an independent regulatory body as it ought to be, began to appear. One of those early articles was, I remember, in Business India, done by Praful Bidwai. And a few other articles began to appear, some of them exposing leakages in the Tarapur plant, for instance, and talking about them. But you know, they were in niche publications, they were not in our big newspapers. What did we find in the big newspapers? There was no questioning. There would be interviews with all the leading scientists, something that goes on till today. There was always this belief that India has to be, just like we had to be proud of our dams, because they were temples of modern India. So we had to be proud as a country that we had nuclear reactors. It was a victory of science in a poor country, and was something to celebrate and not to question. And the media generally, I think, till today I would say, it's very interesting, even media that is critical of a political establishment, somehow on these questions of science and technology, there's a kind of mainstream attitude where you don't really question, where you believe that you have to be supportive of this because this is good for India. You know, it's decided it is good for India. So you shouldn't be too critical. You can be a little critical but not too much. You shouldn't undercut. The words are actually used like that. You should cultivate. I have been told that when I asked that I wanted to cover the nuclear establishment, I was told, no, you are too critical. We need somebody who can cultivate the nuclear establishment. So against this background, what do we read in the newspapers? You know, we constantly read a reiteration of how safe our nuclear reactors are, and how many more we need, and how they will solve the energy problems. Do we read any critical discussion in mainstream newspapers or on television about the cost of these nuclear reactors? The cost not just in terms of the money spent, but the cost in terms of what it will be if there is an accident, and the cost of dealing with the waste. How does that all add up to the per megawatt cost? And is it really comparable to any other source of energy? And therefore, is it needed in a poor country like India? No, we have not had too much discussion on it. Occasionally, but there isn't. But the words that keep coming out at you every time there's an article on nuclear energy is safety, and how it is needed because there is a power crisis. You know, constantly it is posited against the crisis of electric power and how the solution will be nuclear power. But in all these years, you know how much nuclear energy is actually generated? It hardly touches 4,000 megawatts. And I remember more than a decade ago, they were saying that by today there would be 20,000 megawatts. What happened? Where is it gone? Was the money actually allocated? If it was allocated, why wasn't it used? If these reactors have been built, why are they not generating as much as was predicted? What has happened? We want to know also, because this is public money. Nobody is asking these questions. And this is apart from the whole issue of safety and where these power stations should be located. The other thing is you know, the trouble, I was just talking earlier about how many of the journalists are generalists, and increasingly what's happening is many people are being assigned to beats where they are suddenly thrown into the deep end, and especially when it is an issue like, say, nuclear energy, where you need to have a little understanding of the science of it, and also the historical background of nuclear energy in India and how it was promoted and why it's reached this point. So if you're suddenly sent to cover, say, Kudumkulam or Jaitapur, you don't know how to ask the right questions of the people from the nuclear establishment who are running down the movements that are opposing this. because you don't have the background yourself. So the result is you see in the stories, there's very little. You just get everything that is said anyway, without it being questioned. But for instance, how many journalists who are covering any environmental or science issues here would be aware that in Karnataka an energy audit was done by Amulya Reddy when Kaiga was the issue that was being discussed. And his energy audit showed very clearly that actually Karnataka did not need Kaiga because of the fact that so much energy is wasted that if just in transmission losses and the manner in which energy is managed in the state, there was an improvement that in fact you would not need to spend the crores and crores of rupees apart from all the other hazards and the displacement that something like Kaiga caused. But you know, that is like history which is not even brought into the discussion today, but it has to be, because the same kind of energy audit needs to be done of Tamil Nadu. And after all, Tamil Nadu also, you constantly keep hearing about how there's a huge power crisis, and I know when I went to Kudankulam, there was no power for most of the day, for the 2 days that we were there. And it is, but if you constantly keep posing this, saying that there's a huge power crisis, and there are all these people who are opposing, you know, the Kudankulam plant, then you don't have any sense of perspective about what the real issue is. I mean, why is there such a deficit? What has caused it? You know, is it bad planning? Is it bad use of the resources that are already there? You know, I was very surprised when I went to Kudankulam that as we approached Ilintikarai, there was the largest wind energy farm in India is actually located on the route to Ilintikarai. Now, isn't that ironic that here you have a benign alternative form of energy which is right there? And of course, I haven't read many reports actually mentioning this, and that is juxtaposed right next to the Kudankulam plant. But again, as I said, in the discussion on these things, though that background doesn't come in. So then what happens is, you depict people who are opposing something as being anti-national, anti-development, you know, troublemakers, people who don't understand, people who are being misled, that is the word used all the time. And who is being misled, I really want to know. I think the general public is really being misled by our nuclear establishment and by the government by not putting forward the true picture of what is happening with the whole nuclear energy scenario in this country. We're not getting the full story about what is happening. Everything has to be extricated by court cases, by people opposing, only then little bits of information come in. Until today, now finally they're admitting that the AERB is not doing its job. That maybe there is need for a truly independent regulatory authority. Now, if all these years, 60 years, the AERB, 65 years, the AERB, I can't remember when it was set up, you have to tell me. If it has not been doing its job, then what has happened in this process? What are the mishaps that have happened that we don't even know about? Don't we have a right to know before more investment is made into the same kind of energy which holds all these promises but does not deliver? So I think these debates have to be there in the media, because I think these are important questions for the future of all of us. I mean, today there's a nuclear plant being built in Kudankulam. Tomorrow it will be here, you know. And are we going to just sit back and accept it? Are we going to question it or not? And I think the media's role is to give out that information into the public sphere so that there can be a questioning public about these issues. We have to ask questions not only about corruption. We have to ask questions about the manner in which development is going in this country and the things on which money is being spent and who profits or who benefits from these developments. I think these are questions that must be integral to the kind of debates that we generate in the media. And I feel sadly that this has really not happened. And Kudankulam in particular, I think, is a very interesting, again coming back to my earlier point about movements. I think Kudankulam, I didn't realize this myself till I went there. They are also very media savvy. They have actually an excellent media team. Everything that is done is immediately posted on Facebook, the photographs are out, the reports are out. And they have also designed many of their protests in a way that would be attractive to the media. But the story is not just that. You know, again, as with the Anna movement, the media can just rest with showing, running a photograph, which has often been the case, all those boats going towards the Kudankulam plant or those